Just tell me a little bit about, your growing up and where you went to high school and elementary school and kind of what you got into and what you did when you were in school.
Well, I spent the first 19 years of my life in a small town called Linden, New Jersey, 18 miles from New York City, in the direction of Philadelphia. Went to grade school there, went to high school there, was graduated first in my class of 1951.
Congratulations.
Yeah, a bit belated. I spent 2 years at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, majoring in physics, and then switched, got a scholarship at the University of Chicago, spent 3 years there. Carl Sagan and I were classmates for 3 years. He never talked about me being his classmate, and I will talk about him being mine. And he can't explain.
Did you know each other? Did you
We were in the same classes.
Ideas? Did you compare ideas at that time or not?
Well, we were all a bunch of us in the same classes for 3 years, pretty much. We were in the physics department. He went on into astronomy. I went off into industry. I saw him. I was at his home a year before he died. We disagree on the UFO scene, but, we were still friends. And he's heard me lecture once, and I talk about him in my books, sometimes in a sort of negative way, because he said some strange things, if you will. For example, he said that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable and reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but no interesting and reliable sightings, and yet the largest official study ever done for the United States Air Force, Project Blue Book Special Report 14, showed exactly the opposite. The more reliable the sighting, more likely to be unexplainable.
Right.
But, of course, the Secretary of the Air Force himself lied about that study and said even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. But the unknowns weren't 3%. They were 21.5%. And they were completely separate from the 9.3% listed as insufficient information. And the guys did, Carl never references this, of course, and I always do in my lectures. They also did a cross-comparison between the unknowns and the knowns and found the probability that the unknowns are the only ones we're interested in, were just misknowns based on 6 different characteristics, was less than 1%. But Carl nor the other debunkers never talk about that fact. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. That's the mantra for the debunking community. And, it's unfortunate, but it's true in every, I'll call it paranormal. It doesn't deserve that, but what the heck, every paranormal field. 4 basic rules for debunkers. And you can use this on anything because you don't need to know anything. First is, don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up.
Yeah.
The second is, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. The third is, if you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier.
Right.
And 4, do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble, and nobody will know the difference anyway.
Well, what is it that drives people to do that? I mean, these are intelligent people. They're not uneducated, and they should be able to be balanced enough to look at the facts instead of coming from such a highly emotional place.
But intelligent people who have taken a position on a subject about which they know nothing tend to keep taking that position because they'd have to admit that they had goofed, that they had ignored the data, ignored the evidence. It's easier to continue the path of disbelief and distortion than it is to say, hey, I never heard about that. Let's look at that again. And so, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm just a physicist. And in the book, Science Was Wrong, we give many examples of very smart people saying very stupid things that stood in the way of progress. The subtitle tells it, Startling Truths About Cures, Theories, and Inventions They Declared Impossible.
Right.
And, the Max Planck, great German physicist, said it a long time ago. He said, new ideas come to be accepted not because their opponents come to believe in them, but because their opponents die and a new generation grows up that's accustomed to them. So it shall always be, I suppose, but there have to be voices like mine saying, hey, the emperor isn't wearing any clothes. Let's look at the facts here.
So how long are we going to have to wait? I'm sorry, how long are we going to have to wait then until this whole...
I don't know, but the polls...
occurs?
There's a chapter in my book, Flying Saucers in Science, in which I give the results of opinion polls. And there are more believers than non-believers, and the greater the education, the more likely to believe. But most people don't know that. That's why I put it in the book. So I must admit, I'm not a masochist. I've given over 700 lectures, and I've only had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk.
Wow.
And I'm told you get that many if you talk about sports, religion, politics, whatever. I don't talk about those things, so I can't validate that. But
right.
So I grew up in Linden, New Jersey. It was a small manufacturing town. We had General Motors and Gordon's Gin and Standard Oil and a whole bunch of chemical companies because we had direct access for seagoing ships to bring in chemicals. And Linden was the eastern terminus of the Big Inch pipeline, which went from Texas to the big refinery there. And during the war, they produced more than 90% of the high-octane fuel used by the Army Air Force. And we were worried about Germans shelling the refinery and starting one heck of a big fire, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Why
was
did,
that,
unfortunately.
Yeah, because, they never got close to being over here, actually. That doesn't mean there wouldn't have been there.
There were U-boats off the coast of New Jersey. They just didn't get enough, thank goodness.
Okay.
We took air raid sirens and drills very seriously in Linden when I was growing up. It was a good town to grow up in the sense that in my high school, I knew about everybody. We had about 1,200 people in the high school, and most everybody knew each other. And you could be yourself. There were a lot of activities for people. I was in high school debating for over 2 years. We won a state championship. That's why I can take on the nasty, noisy negativists, and I beat them in debates. Basic rule for debate is have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. Yeah. And the debunkers don't abide by that rule. They don't think they need any facts. It's just everybody knows there's nothing to UFOs. Well, just wait, buddy. I'm waiting for you.
Well, not to get too far, of course, but, one of the things that I found that, even within the UFO community, there's an inconsistency in terms of, belief in unity of thought. And I'm just kind of curious as to why that would be. It seems like everybody that if you're researching UFOs, everybody should somewhat be on the same page. But it doesn't really seem to be that way.
No, it doesn't. And as a matter of fact, I remember I mentioned some of these large-scale scientific studies. I do a monthly column in the MUFON Journal and UFO Magazine, and I got notes from a couple of MUFON members saying, what are those 5 large-scale studies that you mentioned? I never heard of them. There's just people on the seriously interested side of the problem. So that's why I talk about these studies, because I want people to know there is data. You don't need to depend on the tabloids of the world or the noisy negativists or Carl Sagan, for that matter. And people who have I get a kick out of the fact that a number of people have told me they've seen me on the Larry King Show. I've been on 4 times altogether, and on one of the shows, Bill Nye, the science guy, was there.
I saw a bit of that clip,
His purpose is to deny. Bill Nye, the science guy. Anyway, several people said, Stan, they ought to have him on more often. He doesn't know anything. He makes you look good.
Well, how can you be called the science guy and you're the nuclear physicist? I'm not exactly sure how that works,
Well, but he does illustrate the rules for the debunkers. One time he showed a document that had one line blacked out, and he said, these guys say there's a cover-up. There's no cover-up. Look at this. That's the guy's address. That's a privacy issue. Fortunately, I had my book, Flying Saucers in Science, with me, and I could open it up real quickly to the page in which I showed a CIA UFO document on which you can read 8 words. Everything else is blacked out. He said, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about privacy issues. We're talking about agencies of the federal government redacting almost everything on a page, and there are many pages like this. And by their definition, it's a UFO document. That kept them a little more quiet for a while, not very long.
Yeah, I just find that curious too. I mean, if they're going to release, a highly classified document, and then they're going to black out most of it, isn't that admitting,
Well, it says they're covering stuff up. Now, admittedly, with the NSA, National Security Agency, or really NSA means no such agency, or never says anything. Anyway, they're one of the biggest black budget operations. They released 160 UFO documents under a Freedom of Information Act request. Took years. These had all been top secret ultra documents, and you could read one line per page. The rest was whited out, not blacked out, whited out. And I called them to get a set of the new ones in the late 90s, and they told me that Phil Klass, who was a debunker, was complaining about the fact that I had shown blacked out documents. They blacked them out first on television, and I didn't tell people it was sources and methods information, which of course I did. Can you believe a page is better than 90% sources and methods information, and the rest is about UFOs? Doesn't make any sense to me. That's typical. And one of the battles I do get into, especially with people who've never had a security clearance — I had a Q clearance for 14 years. Some people, the SETI community is particularly bad at this. SETI, silly effort to investigate.
Right.
Well,
right.
Some people say search for extraterrestrial intelligence.
I think that's what most people know them as, yes.
Yes. Yeah. They say there is no national security aspect here, and the governments can't keep secrets anyway. Look how they fouled up with FEMA and the post office and stuff. Yeah, I wish they talked about the NSA, CIA, DIA, ONI, the alphabet soup agencies. Don't tell me about the post office, for goodness sakes, or FEMA. But anyway, if they get a signal from a distant civilization, they'll make it public right away. And they don't seem to understand that there is a national security aspect here. If the first country to be able to duplicate the flight capability of a flying saucer rules the planet, they make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. They can outmaneuver anything we got flying, that's for sure. So there is a national security aspect. And if you want to talk about not being able to keep secrets, then you have to explain, well, how is it that Lockheed developed a stealth fighter in 10 years under security at a cost of $10 billion with no public discussion about it? That secret was kept. $10 billion involves a lot of people.
Well, there's things that go on in Congress all the time that people don't know about until it actually happens. So I don't have any problem at all believing that secrets can be kept, for sure. Let me ask you a question. Do you believe that the government has actually had contact with extraterrestrial beings? Do you believe that that's the case?
Well, you have to define that a little better. I've reached 4 major conclusions after 52 years of study and investigation. One, the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underlined 39 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft.
And the rest would be reverse engineered, I would assume.
Well, yeah, look, there's only a couple isotopes that are fissionable. What do I care about the ones that aren't if I want to build a nuclear reactor? Most people aren't 7 feet tall, and basketball coach doesn't care about the midgets. Give me one 7-footer,
Okay.
That's the first conclusion. The second conclusion is that the subject of flying saucers, I prefer flying saucers because all flying saucers are UFOs. Not all UFOs are flying saucers. All great-grandfathers are men. I'm one of them, incidentally. But not all men are great-grandfathers.
Right, but
I'm interested in flying saucers, not UFOs.
But on some extraterrestrial craft, at least according to what I sort of read, cigar-shaped and shaped in other forms other than the typical flying saucer.
Well, yeah, the motherships, the large ships, And I was talking to a radar operator the other day who hasn't told anybody public yet, but will be meeting. When he was running radar installations, they had one that showed up several times that was like 8 miles long. And I call that a mothership.
Okay, that's pretty big.
I mean, I know of others a mere half mile to a mile long, but 8 miles, boy, that's a big one.
And it wasn't apparently saucer-shaped either, though. It was probably...
No. Flying saucers become a generic term for alien spacecraft, I guess. The small ones, the Earth excursion modules, as I prefer to use a more sophisticated term, tend to be saucer-shaped, round, relatively flat. There seem to be several models, you know. You look at a highway, and you got your trucks, and you got your small cars, and you've got your motorcycles,
right,
buses, you know, a lot of different vehicles.
Right.
Even look at our spacecraft. They don't all look alike when you boil it down. So the third conclusion I've reached is that there are no good arguments against the first two conclusions. And the fourth is that we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium, visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, bodies and wreckage, for 63 years.
Now, if these guys have been flying around in the skies, and I personally really kind of believe they have, wouldn't it make sense, though, at some point they would have landed at somewhere, even if it's not known to the rest of the human race, per se?
Well, sure, and they have. Ted Phillips in Missouri has collected more than 4,000 physical trace cases from more than 90 countries. These are cases where the witnesses see a craft on or near the ground, and after it leaves, they often watch it come down and also watch it take off. And sometimes little guys get out. 1/6 of the cases involve reports of beings associated with them. And in all these cases, there are physical changes, the equivalent of burn circles, burn rings, landing gear marks, that sort of stuff. So when somebody tells me there is no physical evidence, I say, wait a minute, go look at Ted's listing, will you? Of course, there are also the radar visual cases, the film radar scopes, the photographs that have passed muster. Are there phony photographs? Of course. So what?
Right.
You know, every movie star has a double for the tough scenes, you know, the fast action scenes. That doesn't mean the movie star doesn't exist.
Right.
Just because it's a double. So, you know, and we also have the abduction cases with the physical traces on the bodies, and things like the star map seen by Betty Hill on board a craft in New Hampshire in 1961. That's discussed in detail in Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience by myself and Kathleen Marden, who's Betty's niece. Has all the tapes, transcribed them, all the hypnosis tapes and stuff. And, you know, out of that star map work, I want to demonstrate a different situation in space. The next star over from the sun is 4.3 light years away.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty good distance, but not terribly far. I mean, the galaxy's 100,000 light years across, so 4.3 light years is no big deal. But the base stars that turn up in this star map, and a woman built 26 different three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood to try to match a map that Betty drew after a hypnotic suggestion, if she could remember it accurately, that she had seen on board this craft. The base stars are 39.3 light years away, but much more interesting. They're both sun-like stars, which is only true of about 5% of the stars in the neighborhood. And these two stars are only about 1/10 of a light year apart.
Mm-hmm.
So they're 40 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. We're out in the boonies. These guys got next-door neighbors. And, oh, by the way, those two stars just happen to be a cool billion, some say 3, but I'm very conservative, a cool billion years older than the sun. And from a planet around one, looking over at the other, you can see it all day long.
Yeah.
And you have no trouble at all seeing the other planets. and being able to determine that there's some kind of biological life over there because the composition of the atmosphere reflects that.
Okay.
So it's a very different situation. They'd have one heck of a lot more incentive a long time ago to develop interstellar travel. They got a next-door neighbor.
Of course. So now,
and plenty of time.
But my question though is, so do you? So we know that there've been people that claim the abductions, of course, and we can actually touch on that in a bit as to why and what you think that's about. But do you think that the government has actually made contact itself, that certain portions of the government have made contact with aliens, with extraterrestrials?
Well, it depends what you mean about making contact. Is handling a body from a crash saucer making contact?
No,
do you mean?
I'm talking about, face-to-face conversation, possibly treaties, something like that.
Well, the United States does not speak for planet Earth. I hate to remind Americans of that. I'm a dual citizen of Canada and the United States, so I can complain about both governments, perfectly legal. I have heard two different stories with regard to President Eisenhower, that he might very well have met with aliens out in California and in New Mexico. And the California story, Edwards Air Force Base would have been where it was. The press didn't see him for a while. He was playing golf in Palm Springs, and Southern California, and the press wondered, where's Ike? We haven't seen him at all. So they went to the press secretary, Haggerty, and said, where's the president? They were wondering, a heart attack, something like that. Big news scoop here. Well, he said, let me find out. And he came back with this story that Ike had to go to the dentist. And he was under an anesthetic when they did some work. And so they didn't want to let the world know that he was under an anesthetic and could not, pull the strings on the black box, so to speak. And it's okay, and he'll be here and soon when he's feeling better. And so they did see him later on. Now, a colleague of mine, many years later, went to check on that story. The dentist had died, but he found the dentist's wife, and she didn't remember her husband working on the president. You'd think she would. They checked his medical files. They keep very detailed records on medical stuff for presidents. And no mention of dental work at that time. And they also checked the file of thank you notes. Everybody likes to get a letter signed by the president saying thank you so much for your hospitality and making the trip pleasant and all that sort of thing. And there were none of those either. So he might very well have met with aliens over at Edwards Air Force Base. But there's another story that a guy named Art Campbell has worked on, where a meeting at Holloman Air Force Base. Ike was supposedly playing golf in Georgia, and the presidential airplane took off in secret to New Mexico, landed there, and there was a saucer down the other end of the runway, and supposedly they met together. Now, Art has talked to crew members of that airplane who saw the saucer and know that I went off in secret and so forth. So I'm hoping he's working on a book that'll go into great detail here. So it is conceivable, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
That there have been interactions, but I wasn't there, and I haven't seen any classified reports about it. There's no reason I would, and I don't have a need to know or a clearance these days. So I would say there's a good chance that there has been direct contact. I don't mean they had dinner together necessarily.
Well, I don't think they have the same diet, but but one would not know that either for sure either. But I hear what you're saying now, and I appreciate the way that you're putting it. I know that a lot of people also feel that, like say New Mexico, Area 51, other places like out of where the Montauk Project was on Long Island, that they were actual aliens working in conjunction with human beings on highly secret projects. What would you say?
Well, there's a lot of rumors about a place called Dulce, D-U-L-C-E, supposedly underground bases and uprisings and so forth.
Right.
Now, I've talked to a man named Scott Ramsey, who was in New Mexico a lot, to gathered data about the Aztec, New Mexico saucer crash of March 1948. He's almost finished with a new book, about that. And in the course of doing that, he spent time over near Dulce. And they camped around there for several days, checked with a lot of people, and he could find nothing to back up that story. There were people saying that story. Now, there was somebody at a conference just 2 months ago in New Mexico talking about a colonel whom he couldn't name, who was telling him that that's all true and has spelled out lots of information. But he won't reveal the name, and there has been no evidence put forth to support that story. So absence of evidence is not evidence for absence, but it means you don't have evidence to back it up either. And if you're going to make an extraordinary claim, you ought to have some evidence.
Yeah, that's
besides
true.
The word of an unknown supposed officer.
Yeah.
That's not good enough.
Yeah, I want to take just 1 minute here for one quick second, and I just want to say to any listeners out there that would like to call in and talk to Stanton Friedman, please call in. We have a guest call-in number, and it's 1-877-572-4270. That's 877-572-4270. Please call in. We have 30 minutes at the end of the show. We'd like to open it up to your questions. Stan, sure. Okay, so... All right, so now these guys, again, are buzzing around the planet, and apparently they have been seen by a lot of people, and I mean, there's even this guy, Billy Meyer, over in Switzerland, who claimed that he was taken aboard a Pleiadian spacecraft, and he has these pictures and stuff like that. What is going on with this? I mean, how does this really fit into what we're doing to our lives, and how does this, what should we expect out of this? What should we look forward? The ordinary person, what should they expect to look forward to from all of this? Are we going to just live and see and hear stories of UFOs until we die, and that's just going to be the basis?
Well, I hope not. I hope not. Not that I know when I'm going to die. I mean, I'm only 76. My parents lived to be 90. I got 14 more years to go, darn it.
And then some. And then some.
I hope so. I think we need to stand back and see how we look to them, and why would anybody come here? There's a whole chapter in my book, Flying Saucers in Science, that deals with the why questions. Why would the government cover it up? Why would aliens come here? Why don't they land on the White House lawn? In case people don't know it, I hate to tell you this, but the President of the United States doesn't speak for 6.5 billion Earthlings. Right. Sometimes he has trouble speaking for 309 million Americans.
Right.
But I think I make one assumption about every advanced civilization, only one, that they're concerned about their own survival and security. Everybody we know, every civilization, from the lowest to the highest, seems to be concerned about its own survival. That being the case, you have to keep tabs on the primitives in the area, their neighbors, if you will, but only close tabs on those that show signs of being able to bother you. Now, at the end of World War II, there were 3 signs that soon these idiot Earthlings, whose major activity was obviously tribal warfare, we tend to forget that we Earthlings killed 50 million of our own kind during World War II.
Yeah, I really like that term.
50 million.
I like that term, tribal warfare. It really puts it into perspective. As civilized as we are, that's what we practice. We
destroyed 1,700 cities. I mean, we're not nice guys.
Yeah.
And there were 3 signs that soon we'd be able to take our brand of friendship, which everybody else calls hostility, out there. The 3 signs were nuclear weapons, powerful rockets, the V-2, which we were testing, and which the Germans used to bomb England. They weren't sending the mail that way. And powerful radar, which was the beginning of the electronics era, if you will. There was no radar before the Second World War. And isn't it amazing that the only place on the planet in July 1947 where you could study all 3 of these was southeastern New Mexico? First nuclear bomb was at Trinity site, on the grounds of the White Sands Missile Range, where we were testing the captured German V-2s and where we had our best radar to track the missiles, because sometimes they went south instead of north. Mexicans weren't very happy about that, I might add.
Yeah.
Now, admittedly, I went through this scenario on an English television program, and an astronomer there said, well, they could have gone to the Soviet Union. And I had to say, sorry, no, they couldn't. They didn't test their first A-bomb until August 1949. Mm-hmm. He also thought that why would anybody go to New Mexico? All there is sand. Mm-hmm. I pointed out, he admitted he'd never been there, and 2 of the 3 nuclear weapons labs in the United States are in New Mexico, Los Alamos and Sandia. Biggest employer in the state was Kirtland Air Force Base, White Sands Missile Range, the largest military base in the United States where we were testing those V-2s. Of course, anybody would want to check out New Mexico. Lots of classified research and not many people.
Right.
So
right.
I think one of the reasons for coming here is to make sure we don't go out there. They call it quarantine. But there may be many others. For example, I wonder how many people are aware that the Earth is the densest planet in the solar system. I don't mean the people here. That's probably true, too.
Well, there's some truth in it. Well, one would follow the other, would it not?
Well, a cubic foot of Earth weighs more than a cubic foot of any of the other planets in our solar system. And you say, who cares? Mm-hmm. Well, it matters because that means there's more heavy metals here. And heavy metals are rare in the universe. They don't get made at the beginning of the Big Bang or anything else. It takes a long time, supernovas and stuff, to make heavy metals. Things like uranium, gold, rhenium, osmium, platinum, tungsten, much denser than lead and with special properties, very high melting points and other things. So they may have been stealing goodies here from a long time. And, I surprise people. I say, well, you know what uranium was used for 100 years ago? It was yellow glaze for dining room pottery, table pottery. That's illegal now. But that's what it was used for then.
Was it dangerous then, just out of curiosity? Or was it, don't handle that uranium, don't eat on that uranium?
Well, you could, yeah, if you ate from that stuff for a long time, you'd pick up some radioactivity because the glaze was on the surface, remember. Okay. Yeah, it's illegal to use it as a glaze now. But another metal, zirconium, most people have never heard of it, but the nuclear navy depends on it as a cladding and tubing material for nuclear submarines. And titanium, whoever made anything out of titanium? Well, the SR-71 was made out of titanium, had to develop a whole new industry. Right. What I'm saying is we don't always know the value of what's in the ground around here. Rare earths are finally getting a lot of attention, and there's quite a bit here. Very special properties, but nobody really cared about them before 60 years ago, worth talking about anyway. So aliens may be here for all kinds of reasons. Now, about a month ago, there was a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington about former military guys who were present when UFOs posted themselves above missile sites. One case, Minuteman missile at Malmstrom Air Force Base. Right. Scared the heck out of people because all the missiles went down in one grouping of them. So maybe they're sending us a message. Hey, you idiots, what are you doing this for? It
seems so odd that, that something like that could be discussed. It's odd, so it's obvious that UFOs are there, but yet just as a topic of an everyday topic of subject among the Earthlings, the people themselves, it's still, not, it hasn't really gelled as a reality. But yet at the same time, the UFOs are shutting down, nuclear missile sites.
The story, the press conference did get quite a bit of press coverage, not extended in time, but what the real problem here is the media haven't gotten their act together. I mean, they know there's nothing to this, so why would you spend any time on a subject that's a nothing subject? Why bother having a reporter who knows something about the subject? We don't need that. treated for its, its humor side and conspiracy side, maybe. But do an in-depth story? I mean, look how the New York Times, for example, bought the second, well, it was the fourth explanation for Roswell, the second volume of the Air Force report. The Roswell report, case closed. The first one was about the size of a Manhattan phone book, and it was the Roswell report, Truth versus Fiction in the New Mexico desert. Second one was the Roswell report, case closed. This is the one that had my favorite explanation for Roswell, that the stories about bodies were really because of crash test dummies that the Air Force had been dropping all over the place and, easy to understand. They were found hither, thither, and yon. Now, there's a problem with that explanation. There's a couple of problems, as a matter of fact. I talked to the guy who was in charge of the program. His picture's in the Air Force report. They didn't bother to talk to him, but they had the picture from before. Colonel Madsen. And he pointed out to me that for the test to be meaningful, the crash test dummies had to be the same size and weight as pilots.
Right.
And there's a picture there. The crash test dummies were 6 feet tall and 175 pounds. And they were in uniforms. So, because a pilot who had to eject from an airplane would be in a uniform, Now, the notion that the public somehow managed to spot these and not recognize them for what they were, and that they had somehow morphed from 6 feet and 175 pounds down to a skinny little guy, a little over 4 feet tall with a big head, is pretty silly, especially when you realize that none were dropped until 1953 or later, 6 years after Roswell.
Okay.
But the New York Times bought the explanation hook, line, and sinker, front page.
Yeah.
What do you do? It's kind of like the previous explanation was the mogul balloon explanation. Super secret mogul balloons. Wow.
Right.
The only trouble was that the balloons themselves were not secret. It was their application. The idea was to get a constant altitude balloon, could stay aloft for a long time, and listen for sound waves to be produced by a Soviet nuclear weapon thousands of miles away. Now, the trouble is that none of the balloon technology was classified. They were standard neoprene balloons, the kind you used to buy in a surplus store, And each balloon train had 20 to 25 balloons with 20 feet of string between each of them. And they had sonobuoys and a radio device for sending back information if they picked up a signal. Now, the trouble is, all the ranchers in the area had found balloons because they were used every day at Roswell Army Airfield. Weather balloons. You got and Major Marcel, first military guy to handle this stuff, he had taken a course in radar and balloons. He had to brief B-29 pilots on what the weather would be like on their missions, their simulated missions and stuff. He knew about weather balloons. All the ranchers knew about them. They could get a reward if they brought it in with there was a tag on it, bring in the instrument package, and you'd get a few bucks.
Right, and if you crumple a balloon up, it doesn't automatically expand. It can open up again, and it's like new either. So that's also something that makes a big difference in terms of what it was that Marcel found.
Well, governments are strange beasts, but media is even stranger. I don't know how many people saw the Peter Jennings mockumentary back on February 24th, 2005. Sorry. I was in it for 20 seconds out of an hour interview, and they called me promoter twice in those 20 seconds. But they had a planetarium director from the Hayden Planetarium, Dr. Tyson, and he was talking about, you can't get here from there, basically. Our fastest craft, the Voyager spacecraft, would take 70,000 years to get to the nearest star, and scientists like to get their data before they die. Well, he didn't bother to say, a little detail, it doesn't have a propulsion system on it, it's coasting. At 1G acceleration, you get to the speed of light in a year, for that matter. It's like saying that you can throw a bottle in the ocean and it tells you how long it would take to cross the ocean, or fly a balloon and it'll tell you how long it takes to fly around the world or across the ocean. I mean, utterly ridiculous nonsense. There was much more of it on that program. They had Dr. Jesse Marcel on talking about Roswell, a serving colonel at the time. He'd been called back into the Army to serve in Iraq. He was a helicopter pilot, put in 225 combat hours, was a flight surgeon, and he was 68 when he was called back in. Now, they interviewed him, but they didn't bother to mention that he was a pilot, a colonel, a helicopter, flying combat missions, and a flight surgeon. You'd think those would go to credibility, I would think.
One would think, yeah.
And they had a Harvard-trained PhD in psychology who explained away UFOs as false memory syndrome, utterly nonsensical about, not UFOs, but abductions, false memory syndrome. And she got everything wrong in her book, the names of the people, the times of the events, everything. But they had her on. They left out the comments from Dr. John Mack, who had spent a lot of time and written 2 books about abductions, mind you, who was a professor at Harvard. You'd think they should have included that interview. What I'm saying is, it was a setup. There was some good stuff, and there was a lot of garbage, a lot of baloney. And the media should be ashamed of itself. There've been about 12 PhD theses done about UFOs. One of them was about press coverage. Dr. Herbert Strentz had strong comments to make about the inadequacy of the press coverage. That was 40 years ago, and it has improved a heck of a lot since then, So I'm willing to take on anybody in the Air Force, anybody in the scientific community. I've won some debates, haven't lost any yet, to deal in a formal kind of way with facts and data about flying saucers. Not research by proclamation, but research by demonstration, by referral to evidence, sources, methods, data. Somebody tells me there's no cover-up. Why not look at the 160 National Security Agency classified documents that were released finally, where you can read one line per page and everything else is whited out? No cover-up?
Let me ask you this before we get off the Roswell thing altogether, because I'd like to talk a bit about the abduction thing. That film, did you see that film, Alien Autopsy?
Say that again?
Did you see the film, Alien Autopsy?
I was in it on Fox Network, unfortunately, or fortunately. Yeah, I met with Ray.
Go ahead.
I met with Ray Santilli, who tried to pass that off as legitimate twice in England, mind you. And everything he told me in our first conversation turned out to be a lie when I checked on it. And I wrote that in one of my books. Other people have shown. I found the guy he said took the film. It turned out he had died, and yet he supposedly had been talking to him months before. He died years before.
Okay.
And there was a whole bunch of things. He claimed that President Truman could be seen in the footage, and that it was shot in Dallas, Texas. And I checked with the Truman Library as to, where the president, when he was in Texas and so forth. This is Truman. This is 1947, supposedly. And he wasn't there. There were a whole bunch of things wrong, in other words. But he made a good chunk of money, and so we were had by the Alien Autopsy film, unfortunately. Not we. I wasn't, because I met with him.
Okay. Yeah, it certainly looked hopeful, to say the least. Let's talk about abductions. And a lot of people claim to be abducted. And I know that Dr. David Jacobs has written a book on it, and people have stories to tell. What kind of legitimacy do you feel? What do you feel about that whole abduction?
Well, I believe that each case has to be taken on its own merits. There are some that are phony, no question about it. There are about 30% of the cases, I should stress, that people remember everything. It doesn't need hypnosis. The best case I know, of course, is the Betty and Barney Hill case, because primarily because not only were the people ultra respectable, but the psychiatrist who did the hypnosis work, Dr. Benjamin Simon, was a world-class expert on treatment of what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then it was called shell shock. He ran a hospital after World War II, 3,000 beds for veterans who came back in bad shape psychologically. You know, your buddy's head gets blown off next to you. Sometimes that's a little hard to integrate. And Dr. Simon didn't know anything about flying saucers, but he knew a great deal about helping people get through a missing time experience, you know, something they repressed. And Kathleen Marden, Betty's niece, did a comparative analysis. It's in our book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, between what they said. They were hypnotized separately now, Betty and Barney, and amnesia was induced after each session. So they couldn't talk about what did you say, what did you say.
Right.
He finally played back tapes toward the end of the treatment, if you will. And it's clear that when they were together, their separate, independent descriptions matched. When they were apart, of course, Betty didn't know what was happening to Barney. Now, some people say, well, Betty had a bunch of dreams, and she probably talked about them all the time, and that's what Barney picked up on, and he spit that back. Simply not true if you look at what he said. And as a matter of fact, Betty did have dreams, and she wrote them down. And if you look at what Barney said, it has nothing to do with Betty's dreams. So the debunkers will stoop at anything to try to get rid of the story. Now, they saw this thing in the sky, but it wasn't just a point of light. Some people, Carl Sagan said, a star-like object. Well, for crying out loud, they saw it go in front of or alongside the man on. There was a famous rock formation in New Hampshire. It's on some of their official documents and stuff. And it looks just like a man. It's 48 feet high, like the face of a man. It recently, a few years ago, fell into a lake there, but back then, they described it as being 1.5 times the size of the face.
Okay.
Which would make it 72 feet. Now, how can you call it a star-like object?
Yeah.
And they also noted that they had seen it go in front of the moon. And yet, the debunkers will say, oh, it was just Jupiter. How in the world did Jupiter go in front of the moon? That's a pretty neat trick. Jupiter is a convenient villain. There was a case up in the Yukon seen by, or rather a Japan Airlines case, I guess it was. There were two big objects seen up there. Anyway, it was spotted by people on a plane, a 747, the crew, and they got permission to change their course, and its station kept with them. They talked to the guys on the ground. It was seen on the airplane radar, and the ground radar, two objects, the 747 plus the UFO, big, twice the size of an aircraft carrier, the pilot said. And yet the debunkers say, oh, that was Jupiter. That's pretty neat radar on that 747. And on the ground. So we run into this all the time. But back to the Betty and Barney Hill case. There are many parts of the story. I've been at the exact location where this happened. We followed the route, Kathleen and I, going down Route 3 and other roads in New Hampshire. And Barney, without hypnosis, stood in the road watching with binoculars. This thing was less than a couple 100 feet away. Double row of windows, just sitting up there silently. Saw a bunch of guys behind the windows. Got very frightened and actually broke the binocular strap to tear it away from his face. Went back to the car and said, they're going to capture us. And then it sort of fades out. And they wound up, only location in the area, next to a place big enough for the saucer to set down in. It's a fascinating case. And it was frustrating to me listening to parts of the tape that, why didn't he ask this, that, or the other thing? On the other hand, maybe it's good he didn't. He didn't know about flying saucers. He was trying to help two people work through a post-traumatic stress syndrome situation. And he did that. They didn't want to go public. Somebody made a hidden tape of a little talk they gave to some people and then gave it to a reporter in Boston, and he went public with it. They talked to a lawyer to see if they could stop that, and there was no way they could. They were afraid they were going to lose their jobs. And it's amazing that the noisy negativists don't tell you, Betty was a social worker and a supervisor in the welfare department, state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the post office but was on the governor's civil rights commission. They and Kathleen actually went to the inauguration of President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 by invitation. These are, yes, it was an interracial couple, and that some people make a big deal about that. But these are ultra respectable people. The last thing they needed was to lose their jobs because of a story getting out about an abduction by aliens. There had been no story before that. There had been abductions before that.
So what was the conclusion? What was the conclusion of the abduction? I mean, what was the purpose of it? What was the general conclusion of it?
They were treating them as specimens. Stick a needle here, scrape a little skin there, clip some hair here, stuck a needle in Betty's navel to see if she was pregnant. Later on, we found out about amniocentesis. Didn't know about it then.
Yeah.
Barney, they took some sperm samples too, put a cup over his genitals, and they were examining. And there's some poignant moments. The examining people come into the room. They were in separate rooms. Come in where Betty is and start pulling on their teeth. And she asked the examiner, what are they doing? And he tells her that they can't understand why Barney's teeth come out and yours don't. And Barney had false teeth.
Okay. They're not so smart after all. They can go from star to star, but they can't figure out false teeth.
Well, apparently they couldn't figure out the zipper on her dress, too, because that was torn. And that dress has been analyzed. There's some strange stuff on the dress, physical evidence. There were warts on Barney's groin that the doctor removed, and they weren't normal warts. We don't have them. There were the effects on the car, a bunch of areas, round spots, the size of $50 or so. A bunch of them on the trunk of the car, and you put a compass near them, and the compass would go spinning wildly. You move it away, it stops spinning.
Okay.
And we don't know why. And no, we don't have the car. And isn't it a shame that we didn't have 50 scientists working on the car, but they didn't know about the abduction part, and they didn't want any publicity. So, it's a fascinating story. Captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience. And all of these are at my website, incidentally, www.stantonfriedman.com. Awesome. And one thing you'll get from me or Kathy is you'll get autographs from both of us if you buy from us as opposed to Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. They're in the
so that's www.stantonfriedman.com, right?
www.stantonfriedman.com, and Friedman is Friedman.
Before we get out of run out of time, I just want to get some idea from you also about the USO as opposed to the UFO phenomena. What do you feel about that? Because I know there.
Well, I've talked with Carl Feint, FEINDT, and I heard him give a paper about USOs, unidentified submerged objects, and he's collected over 1,000 reports of such phenomena. Saucers going down into the water, saucers coming up out of the water and flying, which is kind of a neat trick if you're standing on a Navy ship not too far away.
Right.
And also, there are some reports of very high-speed lit objects moving under the water, much faster than a submarine can go. So I think that's part of the picture. And remember, 3/4 of the planet's covered with water, and there are all kinds of nodules of various metals on the bottom of the ocean. we use the bottom of the ocean to store our nuclear submarines so we can attack somebody. They may be mining goodies down there.
Right.
We don't know. But there are many such reports, and they're quite fascinating. The Navy is less than cooperative about giving information out about naval sightings. So we don't have anything. I talked to the historian. I sent him a copy of a report that was co-authored by Naval Intelligence and Air Force Intelligence. Thank you for the interesting report, he says. But as I told you before, we don't have anything about UFOs. What can I say?
Well, it's not for lack of trying.
Well, yeah, sometimes trying is funny. I sent Freedom of Information Act requests, Privacy Act, both, to the CIA and the FBI at the same time, many years ago. I want all my files. I gave them all my background, my Social Security number, my date of birth, my parents' names, everything. Mentioned that I've had a clearance for 14 years. First I hear from the FBI. We don't have a file on you. Sorry. I know they did because they did the security check on me. Then I hear from the CIA. All we have on you is a negative name check request from the FBI, and they sent a copy of it with a little file number. So I sent a copy of that to the FBI and said, could you please check your files again? The CIA apparently had a request, and here's the file number. Get a letter back saying, we rechecked our files, and we do have a file on you. And I sent back a letter saying I'd like to know the size of the file and the level of security. They had said it was classified. Sorry, that information is classified too. So first, they don't have anything,
right?
Even though I knew they did, because I had friends tell me, why is the FBI asking about you?
Right,
for the security clearances, and we need to do them every 5 years. So can you trust the government? Not always.
Okay. I have one caller here on the line that I definitely want to get on before we get off. But before that, I just want to ask you, I know you do all the talking, you do all the touring, the radio programs, you write the articles. What do you want to get out of this? What do you want to get out of this for the Earthlings?
Well, I want people to recognize that they're Earthlings instead of Americans, Chinese, Canadians, Greeks, Peruvians. I think that's the best hope for a decent future for my great-grandson, is an Earthling orientation instead of this nationalistic stuff.
Okay.
I want to get the satisfaction of knowing that people have felt better about being able to tell somebody, me, about their experience. I want to change the world in the sense that religion has a role to play here. And I notice the Pope seems to be being on board. He recently said that, there's no reason God made us. There's no reason he couldn't have made our brethren in outer space.
Okay.
And my jaw dropped, and my thought was, what does he know that we don't know?
Yes, indeed, yeah. Buried down beneath the vaults of the Vatican. Maybe we should wonder about what's going on down there. But, that's really good to hear, actually, still, though, because what that does is that all of his followers can now expand. Their mind can expand a little bit to accept that as well.
Yeah.
So that's really good. Let me get this guy on the line here, and let's see, he has a question for you. It's Granton. Second.
Oh, excuse me. Am I on?
You are on, Ed. How are you?
Okay, pretty good. Listen,
good. You are on the air. You have a question for Stanton?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
I'd like to ask him, at one time on cable TV, there was a UFO program, and they had shown about an incident that was in 1953. It was, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Kinross UFO incident over Lake Superior, where supposedly a F-89C went after a UFO and disappeared. And then there was a diving team that said they found the wreckage, but there was a...
turns out that diving team finding the wreck was a hoax.
Oh, okay.
I hate to say that, but the Mutual UFO Network did a very detailed investigation on that, and it was baloney. You could fill a delicatessen with it, unfortunately.
Okay.
Now, I should say, in the book Shoot Them Down by Frank Ficino Jr., and It's listed on my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, but it's about the events of 1952. And I should mention that the orders were given to military pilots: shoot down UFOs if they don't land when instructed to do so. And an Air Force general admitted there had been 300 scrambles that year. Now, let me go one step past that. Frank lists 200 fatal military aircraft crashes that year, and that were listed in the New York Times, besides those that weren't listed in the New York Times. And two words that showed up: disintegrated and disappeared. Those are very strange words for fatal crashes, aren't they?
Yeah.
So, and I have personally heard 7 instances, quietly, these people weren't looking for publicity, of planes going up to chase UFOs and never coming back. This is not from the pilots, obviously, because they didn't come back, but from ground members and stuff. One case from an aircraft carrier, the ground crew, aircraft carrier crew, saying the plane never made it back, and it was sent up to scramble to chase a UFO. And so they don't seem to be nasty, but you're going to attack them, they'll give you back. When a guy's got a radar lock on, he's going to fire a missile at you. You don't have much choice but to zap him, I should think. Mm-hmm. If you've got the right kind of equipment to do some zapping with. So the Kinross case is not the only case, is what I'm saying, and I wasn't including that in the 7 because I didn't hear anything about that personally from somebody who was there, that kind of thing. But it's a case, if you Google it, I'm sure you'll find quite a bit of information. It's unfortunate that people tried to make a bunch of money out of that by saying they had found the wreckage and so forth, but sorry, wrong number.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Ed, do you have any other questions you want to direct?
One last one. I'm kind of curious. I look at a lot of UFO shows, and I notice it seems to be that there's really a lot of activity in Mexico, especially around Mexico City. And I was just, if Mr. Friedman had any idea why there's so much UFO activity in Mexico.
Well, it's not so much a question of how much activity. I check my audiences, and only 10% of the people who've had sightings report them. Mm-hmm. But a reporter, a journalist down there named Jaime Maussan, which was on a big national, network television show, people sent him some footage that they'd taken, and he played it and treated it squarely straight. And so he encouraged people to send him all kinds of stuff. And so they've had a lot of press coverage, making it much less unlikely that people won't report what they see. It's okay down there. So, and in some of those cases, we know that they weren't flying saucers, certainly, that they were, balloons or whatever. But they have Jaime has definitely encouraged people to come forward with their testimony. And, you don't see NBC, ABC, and CBS doing that, do you?
No.
Not very often, anyway. So I don't know that there's any more there than any place else, but it gets a lot more publicity.
Okay. Okay, listen, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ed. Thank you for calling in.
Okay.
So, Stanton, one last question as we wrap down the last 20 minutes or so, unless we get another caller. You were on the Ancient Alien series recently. You did several appearances on that. How do you tie that in with what's going on now? I mean, is it a possibility that the aliens, again, I hate that word, the extraterrestrials came around then, and have they ever left maybe? Maybe they never left. Maybe, you know.
There's several possibilities here. If you look at Barry Downing's book, The Bible and Flying Saucers, he goes back into the Old and New Testaments and finds sightings. Now, they didn't use saucers, so they weren't called that, but, the pillar of fire by night, the cloud by day, et cetera. And my view of things is that there's been intelligent life in the neighborhood for an awful long time. I was just reading about, there's a city in southern Africa, a huge development, and they only have the stone, what's left kind of thing, that apparently existed more than 60,000 years ago, and about which we previously knew nothing.
Which part of Africa is this? Which part?
In the Union of, down in southeastern Africa, less than 100 miles from the coast.
Okay.
And a guy named Tellinger has written a couple of books, and I expect to see him. I'll be speaking at a conference in Atlanta February 4th and 5th, and he's going to be speaking there too, so I'm looking forward to hearing him. But the point of mentioning that is that we like to think that we know the whole history of the planet, just a few thousand years ago, the pyramids and so forth. As far as I'm concerned, there probably have been many different civilizations here, and various disasters have occurred. A guy named Henrik Schliemann figured out from the Iliad, mind you, where Troy ought to be. And a historian said, "What are you looking? There's no Troy. That's a myth."
Yeah.
Well, he figured out where it ought to be. He was rich enough to afford to pay people to dig down 75 feet, and they found Troy, and that's only from a few thousand years ago. How much of the planet have we explored down 75 feet? Not much.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that I think the neighborhood is teeming with life. There's been colonization and migration. I get a kick out of the SETI cultists saying, well, maybe there's 10,000 planets in the galaxy that could send out radio signals. That's 1 in 10 million stars, that would be able to do that. I think it's more like several billion because of migration and colonization, and they don't allow for that. Why would you migrate and colonize? Because you run out of goodies where you are, because you know there can be natural disasters. Look, we had a lot of dinosaurs around here, 150 million years ago?
Yeah.
They got wiped out by something, probably a hunk of rock, an asteroid, hitting the planet and making a terrible mess of the place, throwing up enough dirt, so the sunlight was cut off and the plants don't grow, and pretty soon these big guys die. They needed plants. So what I'm saying is that I think there's life all around us. I think they pay not too close attention when all you got is primitives. Check them out every 50 years, see what's going on. Once you hit a certain point where you start manufacturing and show signs of technology, you realize before 1900 there was no radio, there was no nuclear, there were no airplanes, no rockets, no all kinds of things. But look how rapidly we went from North Carolina, Kitty Hawk, in 1903, December 17th, to landing on the moon in July 1969. 66 years from being stuck on the ground to being able to put man on the moon.
Yeah.
And more importantly, we also have discovered how the stars produce their energy. Now we're really a threat. Nuclear fusion. I mean, you realize we didn't even know there were neutrons until 1932? We figured out about fusion, theoretically, in 1938. First atomic bomb was 1945. That's fission. And the first fusion weapon, the first H-bomb, was 2002. Now listen to three numbers. A big bomb during World War II was a 10-ton blockbuster. Released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. Took a big B-29 to carry it. Okay, at the end of the war, we had atomic bombs, 12,000 tons of TNT equivalent. 1952, a mere 7 years later, 10 million tons of dynamite.
Yeah.
And the Russians tested, the Russians tested one that was 57 million tons of dynamite. Now, if you were an alien, what would you say about these idiots? The fireball on our first H-bomb was 3 miles wide.
Yeah.
So, there are two things here. One is the kind of beings we are, nasty guys, weapons. The second is that we have unleashed the means for getting us to the stars. I worked on the fusion propulsion system examination way back in the 60s. If you use the right stuff in the right way, and it wouldn't be cheap, You could fire rockets that will exhaust particles that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. 10 million times. And here's a number for you. It only takes 1 year at 1g acceleration to get next to the speed of light. And incidentally, at 99.99% of the speed of light, you can go 37 light years in 6 months pilot time.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, aliens would be idiots not to be checking the neighborhood for guys like us. You know, could anybody check this place out and say we're a peace-loving civilization? I mean, this year we Earthlings will spend $1 trillion on things military. It's a little more than that, but about $1 trillion.
Yeah.
This year, every single day of the year, 30,000 children will die needlessly of preventable disease and starvation.
Yeah.
Does that tell you something about this planet?
Yeah, that does. It says a lot, actually. It says we're not very civilized, are we? We're technologically advanced, but not very civilized.
Yeah, we need a little sociology to go with the technology, I'm
I
afraid.
think we do. I have another caller, actually. I want to get another question in here, too.
Okay, good.
Hold on a second.
This
Hello,
is
you're
Kurt.
on the air. Hello.
This is Kurt from
Yes.
Pennsylvania. I have
Yes,
a question
how are
for the guest. Pretty
Yes.
good. Do you believe Bob Lazar worked on UFO reverse engineering at Area 51?
Well, I've done a lot of investigation on Bob Lazar because he was calling himself a nuclear physicist, and I am one, and I can prove it by my work for GE, GM, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, McDonnell Douglas, etc., my membership in professional groups. Did a lot of checking on Bob. And to summarize a lot of work, he claimed now that he had a master's in physics from MIT and a master's in electronics from Caltech, and that he worked at Area 51 to back engineer flying saucers and figured out how they work using element 115 and gravity wave amplifiers, which sounds very impressive. Now, I checked with MIT and 5 different offices. Nobody ever heard of him, including the legal counsel who said there's no way to hide, to wipe a record clean. I talked to his high school in New York State and on Long Island, as a matter of fact, and he graduated in August, not with his class. He had one science course, chemistry. He wound up finishing in the bottom third of his high school class. There's no way in the world he could have been accepted at MIT. Now, Caltech never heard of him. He had a talk in Rachel, Nevada, on the extraterrestrial highway. Somebody asked him, can he remember the names of any of his professors? And he thought for a moment, says, well, let's see, Bill Duxler, he'll remember me from the physics department at Caltech. He made a mistake, because Detective Friedman went to work and located William Duxler, physicist, PhD, and talked to him. The only trouble is he never taught at Caltech, only at Pierce Junior College, which is in the San Fernando Valley, out near L.A., and he was a little irked that Bob was using his name, and so he checked, and indeed, Bob had taken a course under him in the very same year when he was supposedly at MIT, 2,500 miles away. That's a long commute, and if you can go to MIT, you don't go to Pierce Junior College. Furthermore, element 115, which he said was the basis of everything, at one point he was saying, he doesn't anymore, that Los Alamos had 500 pounds of this stuff. The only trouble is it has a very short half-life. At a big accelerator, we manufactured 4 atoms, not 4 pounds, not 4 grams, 4 atoms of 115 by operating the accelerator for, I think it was 3 weeks. No way in the world they could have 500 pounds, because when a half-life is less than a second, actually it's less than a millisecond, less than a thousandth of a second, there's no way you can collect enough. It decays. You never have 500 pounds. Also, Bob claimed he worked as a physicist for Los Alamos, and his name is in the phone book. You look at the top of the page, it says for employees of the Department of Energy of Los Alamos National Laboratory, and it named a bunch of subcontractors. After Bob's name, it said K/M, Kirk Meyer. So he didn't work for the lab. He worked at the lab, one of many subcontractors, at the Clinton D. Anderson Maison facility. It's a unique accelerator, and professors would come from around the United States to do experiments there, and they needed people to help them out setting up equipment. Bob's a sharp guy, very handy, built a jet-powered car, used to put on fireworks displays, and so he undoubtedly helped these guys. It's not a classified job, you understand. So my answer would be he doesn't check out. He is a bright guy. Oh, he never belonged to the American Physical Society, never published a paper, supposedly had to have a master's thesis. There is none on record at MIT. And his buddy asked me, what would it take to convince me, that he was legitimate? And I said, well, I'd like to see a resume, listing in an alumni directory, membership in the American Physical Society, American Nuclear Society, stuff like that, a list of papers he's published. I never got anything back. I sent copies of all my stuff. So Bob, sharp guy who fooled a lot of people, clever guy. I understand he's moved to Michigan now from New Mexico, which he moved to from Las Vegas. Real person, sharp guy, but he sure didn't work on back engineering flying saucers as a nuclear physicist at Area 51. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. So then, we have such a short time, so you're saying there are no back-engineered craft?
I didn't say that. I don't know if there are or not. I would hope they were trying to. But, if you gave Christopher Columbus a nuclear submarine and said, Chris, unlimited budget, I need 2 more of these. Can you build them for me? Not a chance.
Well, now that I understand. Let me ask you one last question that we can maybe talk about before we get ready to wind down here, and that is about SETI and NASA. And millions and billions of dollars go a year into the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and meanwhile, flying saucers are bopping around all over the place. What
actually
is the disparity between that?
Well, actually, SETI doesn't spend billions of dollars. They've had donations from people like Allen, who was one of the co-founders of Microsoft. They're building the Allen radio telescope array. It's tax deductible. Of course, if he sold the stock, he would have to pay tax on the gains. So he can make money by giving it away. SETI makes some very unscientific assumptions. The first is that aliens out there are sending us signals using techniques compatible with our technology. We've only had radio for a little over 100 years. I hate to say this on a radio program, but the notion that the aliens out there are stuck at the same level of technology as we are is absurd. I don't use the slide rule anymore. I did when I worked in industry a lot of years ago. That's the first thing. Second thing, they say they're interested in extraterrestrial intelligence, but they refuse to look at any of the evidence related to extraterrestrial intelligence, flying saucers. They, if you read their book, I read their books. They won't read mine, of course. Although Seth Shostak said he had a copy of my book, Flying Saucers and Science, on his nightstand. He didn't say he'd read it, but I'd sent him a copy with his approval, and maybe someday he'll read it. They never refer to the UFO evidence. Dr. Jill Tarter says there is no evidence, but within 1,000 light years there may be another civilization, and when we make contact, it'll be a great day, and they'll help us solve our problems. Hey, out there, I got some problems. 2,000 years later, you get a signal back. Oh, what can we do to help you? Oh, boy. What kind of scenario is that?
Well, what about NASA?
Well, NASA is not spending any money on SETI. They are looking at astrobiology. They're looking at extremophiles, so life in strange situations like high pressure, high temperature, beneath the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. NASA does sponsor classified programs. When I was working on nuclear rockets, NASA was sponsor other programs, Space Nuclear Propulsion Office, and the data was classified. The existence of the programs wasn't classified. You'll never hear from the SETI people about nuclear propulsion. We operated a number of rather exotic nuclear rockets way back in the 60s. The biggest one, Los Alamos, less than 7 feet in diameter, 4,400 megawatts. That's twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam. This was 7 feet in diameter, and it worked. They won't talk to you about that. But so NASA has stayed out of the UFO discussion, but fortunately, there's a new book coming out by a guy named Nick Redfern, who's written a number of books about UFOs, and it's about NASA and the cover-up. And I've ordered it, and I expect to get it next week, so then I'll tell you more. But Nick's a sharp guy, does research. We don't always agree, but he doesn't make things up on the top of his head usually.
Okay.
All right. So we'll find out more about NASA soon. What we'll find out? Well, I don't know.
Okay, I was just curious. I mean, I know that they, all the different years that NASA has been sending probes to Mars and out in space, and that somehow UFOs haven't managed to get in their line of view.
Well, you know that more and more people believe that there's life out there because the SETI guys have talked about this for so much time. Carl Sagan, I'll give him credit, did more to get people interested in extraterrestrial intelligence out there than anybody else. The problem is they're not looking at data related to extraterrestrial intelligence. And there's nothing wrong with finding out about the planets in our solar system. After all, just about everything we find out proves that the astronomers were wrong 60 years ago. It won't hurt to find that out, will it?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's true. I mean, and, as I said, I've worked on NASA-sponsored programs. And I'll tell you something. The worst meeting I ever attended, I was working for Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab. I was out at Aerojet General in California. We were both working on nuclear rockets. My specialty was radiation shielding. And my counterpart out there said, "Hey, Stan, want to go to a meeting? The Space Nuclear Propulsion Office is having a meeting on what we should do with the nuclear rocket." "Sure, I'd love to go." Well, I'll tell you something. They didn't have the faintest idea of what they wanted to do with this nuclear rocket technology. "Oh, we could send a man to Mars, but I don't know if the public would pay for that. We could set up a base on the moon. We could do Earth orbit, lunar orbit rendezvous." They didn't know what they wanted to do, and that means your program's going to get canceled because there are a lot of people who know what they want to do with government money. And I was very disappointed. No leadership. What they needed was an Admiral Rickover. He's the guy who developed the nuclear submarine. People forget that the first nuclear submarine was operated in 1956, the Nautilus, and there have been hundreds built by a bunch of countries. And to really shock people and to see how we tend to forget nuclear propulsion, the Navy has nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, big old monsters, not only the United States, but Russia and I think Britain too. Anyway, these monsters can go 18 years without refueling.
Wow.
That's impressive as heck to me, anyway.
Yeah.
Think of all the ships loaded with fuel, diesel fuel, whatever they use, bunker C, that it would take to do that. 18 years without refueling. That's quite remarkable, but nobody talks about that. Oh, we're stuck with chemical rockets. No, we're not.
Well, I'll tell you, we're lucky that we have you then. Because, when you get the opportunity to, and you get the questions, and you have the chance to speak with large groups of people or over the radio or whatever, you get to share this stuff that you know. And, it's just true that you're just one man, but at least you're out there doing it and letting people know.
I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one saying exciting things, but I got a big mouth and got a great website, thanks to my webmaster, www.stantonfriedman.com.
And what is the name of that new book again?
The newest book is Science Was Wrong. The one before that was Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. The One before that was Top Secret, no, Flying Saucers in Science, then Captured, then before that was Top Secret Magic, M-A-J-I-C, and keep your eyes open for a movie, Magic Men.
If you're researching UFOs, you should everybody should somewhat be on the same page. But it doesn't really seem to be that way.
No, it doesn't. And as a matter of fact, I remember I mentioned some of these large-scale scientific studies. I do a monthly column in the MUFON Journal and UFO Magazine, and I got notes from a couple of MUFON members saying, what are those 5 large-scale studies that you mentioned? I never heard of them. There's just people on the seriously interested side of the problem. So that's why I talk about these studies, because I want people to know there is data. You don't need to depend on the tabloids of the world or the noisy negativists or Carl Sagan, for that matter. And people who have I get a kick out of the fact that a number of people have told me they've seen me on the Larry King Show. I've been on 4 times altogether, and on one of the shows, Bill Nye, the science guy, was
there. I saw a bit of that clip,
His purpose is to deny, Bill Nye, the science guy. Anyway, several people said, Stan, they ought to have him on more often. He doesn't know anything. He makes you look good.
Well, how can you be called a science guy and you're the nuclear physicist? I'm not exactly sure how that works,
Well, but he does illustrate the rules for the debunkers. One time he showed a document that had one line blacked out, and he said, these guys say there's a cover-up. There's no cover-up. Look at this. That's the guy's address. That's a privacy issue. Fortunately, I had my book, Flying Saucers in Science, with me, and I could open it up real quickly to the page in which I showed a CIA UFO document on which you can read 8 words. Everything else is blacked out. He said, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about privacy issues. We're talking about agencies of the federal government read the path of disbelief and distortion than it is to say, hey, I never heard about that. Let's look at that again. And so, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm just a physicist. And in the book, Science Was Wrong, we give many examples of very smart people saying very stupid things that stood in the way of progress. The subtitle tells it, Startling Truths About Cures, Theories, and Inventions They Declared Impossible.
Right.
And, the Max Planck, great German physicist, said it a long time ago. He said, new ideas come to be accepted not because their opponents come to believe in them, but because their opponents die and a new generation grows up that's accustomed to them. So it shall always be, I suppose, but there have to be voices like mine saying, hey, the emperor isn't wearing any clothes. Let's look at the facts here.
So how long are we going to have to wait? I'm sorry, how long are we going to have to wait then until this whole...
I don't know, but the polls...
occurs?
There's a chapter in my book, Flying Saucers in Science, in which I give the results of opinion polls. And there are more believers than non-believers, and the greater the education, the more likely to believe. But most people don't know that. That's why I put it in the book. So I must admit, I'm not a masochist. I've given over 700 lectures, and I've only had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk.
Wow.
And I'm told you get that many if you talk about sports, religion, politics, whatever. I don't talk about those things, so I can't validate that. But
right.
So I grew up in Linden, New Jersey. It was a small manufacturing town. We had General Motors and Gordon's Gin and Standard Oil and a whole bunch of chemical companies because we had direct access for seagoing ships to bring in chemicals. And Linden was the eastern terminus of the Big Inch pipeline, which went from Texas to the big refinery there. And during the war, they produced more than 90% of the high-octane fuel used by the Army Air Force. And we were worried about Germans shelling the refinery and starting one heck of a big fire, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Why
was
did,
that,
unfortunately.
Yeah, because, they never got close to being over here, actually. That doesn't mean
there
wouldn't have been there.
There were U-boats off the coast of New Jersey. They just didn't get into enough, thank goodness.
Okay.
We took air raid sirens and drills very seriously in Linden when I was growing up. It was a good town to grow up in the sense that in my high school, I knew about everybody. We had about 1,200 people in the high school, and most everybody knew each other. And you could be yourself. There were a lot of activities for people. I was in high school debating for over 2 years. We won a state championship. That's why I can take on the nasty, noisy negativists, and I beat them in debates. Basic rule for debate is have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. Yeah. And the debunkers don't abide by that rule. They don't think they need any facts. It's just everybody knows there's nothing to UFOs. Well, just wait, buddy. I'm waiting for you.
Well, not to get too far, of course, but, one of the things that I found that, even within the UFO community, there's an inconsistency in terms of, belief in unity of thought. And I'm just kind of curious as to why that would be. It seems like everybody that
known 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions
if
more complete observational data had been available. But the unknowns weren't 3%; they were 21.5%, and they were completely separate from the 9.3% listed as insufficient information. And the guys did, Carl never references this, of course, and I always do in my lectures. They also did a cross-comparison between the unknowns and the knowns and found the probability that the unknowns are the only ones we're interested in, were just misknowns based on 6 different characteristics, was less than 1%. But Carl nor the other debunkers never talk about that fact. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. That's the mantra for the debunking community. And, it's unfortunate, but it's true in every, I'll call it paranormal. It doesn't deserve that, but what the heck, every paranormal field. 4 basic rules for debunkers. And you can use this on anything because you don't need to know anything. First is, don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up.
Yeah.
The second is, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. The third is, if you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier.
Right.
And 4, do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble, and nobody will know the difference anyway.
Well, what is it that drives people to do that? I mean, these are intelligent people. They're not uneducated, and they should be able to be balanced enough to look at the facts instead of coming from such a highly emotional place.
But intelligent people who have taken a position on a subject about which they know nothing tend to keep taking that position because they'd have to admit that they had goofed, that they had ignored the data, ignored the evidence. It's easier to continue the...
Just tell me a little bit about your growing up and where you went to high school and elementary school and kind of what you got into and what you did when you were in school.
Well, I spent the first 19 years of my life in a small town called Linden, New Jersey, 18 miles from New York City, in the direction of Philadelphia. Went to grade school there, went to high school there, was graduated first in my class of 1951.
Congratulations.
Yeah, a bit belated. I spent 2 years at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, majoring in physics, and then switched, got a scholarship at the University of Chicago, spent 3 years there. Carl Sagan and I were classmates for 3 years. He never talked about me being his classmate, and I will talk about him being mine. And he can't explain.
Did you know each other? Did you
We were in the same classes.
Ideas? Did you compare ideas at that time or not?
Well, we were a bunch of us in the same classes for 3 years, pretty much. We were in the physics department. He went on into astronomy. I went off into industry. I saw him. I was at his home a year before he died. We disagree on the UFO scene, but, we were still friends. And he's heard me lecture once, and I talk about him in my books. sometimes in a sort of negative way because he said some strange things, if you will. For example, he said that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable and reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but no interesting and reliable sightings, and yet the largest official study ever done for the United States Air Force, Project Blue Book Special Report 14, showed exactly the opposite. The more reliable the sighting, more likely to be unexplainable.
Right.
But of course, the Secretary of the Air Force himself lied about that study and said even the